All of Khrushchev's grand schemes required resolution of the Berlin crisis. 1,500 East Berliners a day were flooding across the open border with the West. 3,500 doctors had crossed in the previous 2 years. Teachers, scientists, lawyers, East Germany was losing its entire professional class. Berlin had become the focal point of the Cold War, and Kennedy knew it.
He didn't think about anything else. He wasn't thinking about, his legislative program for the year or any of the other things that occupy presidents. This is the problem that was going to occupy him, and until it was settled, that nothing else was going to get done much.
Shortly after Jack's death, Bobby recorded an oral history for the Kennedy Library that's been released for this program. Bobby knew that at this stage in his presidency, his brother was preoccupied with the thought of fighting a nuclear war over Berlin.
He had a hell of a tough time, you see, after the Bay of Pigs. Not just right now the Bay of Pigs, but Berlin.
Yeah.
Which people really, I don't think, understood generally around the country.
No.
The president felt strongly, and I did, that we were very close to war.
1 week after the Vienna summit, Khrushchev announced a 1/3 increase in Soviet defense spending. Kennedy matched the escalation. He sent Congress a request for an additional $3.5 billion in defense spending, a tripling of the draft, and authority to call up the reserves. One policy was non-negotiable. The U.S. intended to honor its commitment to defend West Berlin.
We do not want to fight, but we have fought before, and others in earlier times have made the same dangerous mistake of assuming that the West was too selfish and too soft and too divided to resist invasions of freedom in other lands. To sum it all up, we seek peace, but we shall not surrender.
But there was one glaring qualification. The American pledge was limited to West Berlin. Kennedy made no mention of American rights to unfettered access to the whole of the German capital. That omission gave Khrushchev his opening.
Kennedy is saying he wants to preserve his influence in West Berlin and maintain the status quo there. He spells out his conditions, and he signals to the Soviets, if you follow these conditions, you can do whatever you like in and with East Berlin.
On August 13, 1961, Khrushchev gave his response. Thousands of East German troops moved into position at every crossing point between East and West. The construction of the Berlin Wall was about to begin. In the western sector, there was a fear of a communist invasion. 10,500 East German troops marched up to the partition line and stopped.
And when the news was broadcast over the radio and printed in the newspapers, one simply couldn't believe it. One simply couldn't imagine it. We were speechless. To imagine that this whole city was separated just like that. There were relatives on both sides. People who looked after their old parents in the East, for example. And some of them died without having ever seen each other again.
Standing along the line dividing Berlin, Mayor Willy Brandt felt that the Soviets had provoked the worst crisis of the Cold War. He wanted Washington to respond by crossing the border and tearing the fence down. Egon Bahr was Brandt's principal deputy.
I went immediately to the City Hall. Brandt was called a little bit earlier, and he was immediately at the borderline. And then he went to the three commandants and came back furious, because they are incapable. I cannot tell you in English, the real word he said, Arschlöcher. They had no orders. They did nothing.
For 3 days, Kennedy refused to comment. During this time, he was on vacation at the family compound at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, sailing apparently without a care in the world. In reality, Kennedy was relieved to see the wall go up. He knew it provided Khrushchev a way out of direct confrontation with the West.
Kennedy's problem was we couldn't defend Berlin or West Germany or Western Europe without using nuclear weapons. We had 15,000 troops with the British and French in Berlin. They were surrounded by 30 divisions of the Red Army. The Soviets could have taken Berlin in a day. They could have taken West Germany in a couple of weeks. Maybe they would have gotten all the way to the Atlantic. And Kennedy had only one option if that began. That was either to let them do it or to use nuclear weapons.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately recognized that Khrushchev had diffused a volatile situation and handed the West a colossal propaganda coup.
It was a symbol of their weakness. Hell, they built the wall to hold back the East Germans who wanted to leave East Germany and go to the West. So, and that's the way Kennedy interpreted it. We should make the West see this as a major sign of weakness of the Soviets, which it was. And therefore, he resisted the pressure from those who said, apply military force to tear down the wall. There were many who did say that.
By the fourth day, when there was still no move by the Western powers, Phase 2 was ordered by Moscow. The barbed wire was replaced by a pair of concrete walls, 12 feet high, separated by a death zone, a 50-foot strip filled with landmines. And yet still they came, thousands willing to risk everything for one desperate dash across open ground to freedom. Walter Thoreau had joined the East German Army. He believed those escaping were traitors. That was before he was assigned to the border and given his instructions.
For me, what caused a total change of heart was the order to shoot and what that would mean. This order to shoot was issued by the Minister of National Defense, and it read, anyone who approaches the border or attempts to cross to West Berlin is a traitor, a provocateur. They aren't escapees, they are criminals. Call out to them, tell them that a warning shot will be fired, then shoot.
Thousands would continue to defy the wall. Families would come to the wall to look across the divide. This young couple on their wedding day waved to parents they wouldn't see again for nearly 20 years.
Tears of a mother, the sadness of a bride. That is Berlin today.
The wall may have prevented escalation to a wider war, but the casualties were real nevertheless. One personal tragedy in particular came to symbolize the cost of American detachment.
The point was that Peter Fechter wanted to cross the wall, and he was from the eastern side shot down, fell back to the eastern side, and died 50 minutes crying. And the lieutenant, which was nearby, were asked by the West Berliners, you are an American, you can help him. Bring him out, cross the wall. And he answered, this is above my order. And in this moment, the West Berliners realized that the whole talking about for power status is to some degree nonsense. The real responsibility and capability of the three Western powers is ending on the sector borderline.
By early October, 15 people had been killed as they tried to reach freedom. Each day brought the chance that the crisis would escalate into open conflict. Soviet and American tanks started to move towards Checkpoint Charlie, one of the few crossing points between East and West. Washington and Moscow braced themselves for the next step. Each side mistrusted the other's intentions. Each insisted they would never back down.
We came very, very close to war then. As a matter of fact, I brought General Larry Norstad, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, over to Washington to meet with me in my office to advise me on what was going to happen and tell me what he recommended we should do under certain alternatives. I said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How's this going to evolve? He said, well, they'll do E, we'll do F, they'll do G, we'll do H, and they'll do I. I said, what do we do then? Well, he said, I guess we have to use nuclear weapons. Now, that was in the fall of 1961.
Kennedy wanted to break the impasse, but he couldn't escape the reality that any miscalculation could ignite world conflict. To diminish that prospect, Kennedy asked his brother to establish a personal back channel linking the White House to the Kremlin, a channel that would avoid the distortion and delay of their respective bureaucracies. Before one meeting, Bobby Kennedy called the president's secretary to find out whether his brother had any guidance for him.
I'll have to talk to him by 12:30.
Okay.
If he's not out by 12:30, would you just send him a note that I have to leave for lunch with the Russian ambassador, and if he has any instructions for me.
Bobby Kennedy learned from his father, a smart Irish politician, that you have to do things in many different ways. You go through the front door, but you also have to go through the side door and the back door. You need several channels. One is not enough. And Bobby brought that instinct or that practice to foreign policy, so that while, of course, we dealt with the Soviet Union through the UN and the State Department, Bobby ran his own back channel with Georgy Bolshakov, a Soviet spy who was based in Washington, who was able to deliver messages to the Kremlin.
It was through assurances delivered to Bolshakov that both sides withdrew their forces at Checkpoint Charlie. Another crisis resolved short of war. Kennedy wondered how long his luck would hold.
I said, you sleep well? It was kind of a joke a little bit, and he said, yeah. He said, okay. He said, at first I did worry, and I perhaps didn't sleep all that well. He said, I tried to put the world together during the day, and then Khrushchev would take it apart at night. But he said, I now don't worry about it. That's just what happens. And you come back and you work at it each day. And that's just part of the chess game that we play.
On October 30th, 1961, Khrushchev made his next move. Breaking a promise given at the summit, he unilaterally restarted atmospheric nuclear testing. The 50-megaton explosion was 10 times the combined power of all weapons used during the Second World War, including the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs. It sent shockwaves around the world and would be a prelude to the greatest crisis of the Cold War. There were moments during the Kennedy administration when superpower rivalry was transformed from an expression of man's barbarity to an expression of mankind's ultimate capability.
We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people.
Cape Canaveral, February 20th, 1962.
Order systems, go!
After 10 aborted attempts, Friendship 7 was finally on the pad, ready to fly.
Mercury capsule? No. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on. Eject Mercury umbilical.
Atop an Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile, Colonel John Glenn was strapped into a capsule in the spot where a nuclear warhead would normally go.
Mercury umbilical clear. Mercury is on. Lights on.
Unlike the Soviet space program, there was no news blackout to conceal failure.
T-minus 18 seconds and counting engine start.
This was going to be broadcast as it happened.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
Americans, more than any other people on the planet, have this sense of hope and unlimited possibility about the future. And Kennedy, in so many ways, tapped into that. And the space program is probably the best example of his ability to inspire our imagination, because he takes our fears and he transforms it into hope.
Over the next 5 hours, Colonel Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth, an instant American hero.
Getting out of the vibration area. Roger, reading your louder.
If only he'd been a Negro, Vice President Lyndon Johnson lamented, believing that if he had been, it would have improved race relations in America.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
NASA had arranged for Kennedy to phone Glenn during the mission. Then word reached the White House that the capsule's heat shield may have been damaged.
This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside.
Fearing a congratulatory call just before the astronaut burned up on re-entry, Kennedy waited until Glenn was safely aboard the USS Noah.
Chute is out in reach condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute. Hello? Hello, sir? Colonel? This is Colonel Glenn. Oh, listen, Colonel, we're really proud of you, and I must say you did a wonderful job. Well, it was a wonderful trip. It's almost unbelievable to think back on it right now, but it was really tremendous.
John Glenn was paraded through Washington in the pouring rain, a personification of the new frontier. Bold, courageous, willing to accept a mission fraught with danger. Just as Kennedy had hoped, the manned space program was showing the world what American ingenuity could achieve.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
It is for him a definition of American character and a symbol of American achievement and promise for the rest of the world.
18 months into his presidency, John Kennedy was defining a new kind of America. Not just a new kind of politics, but a new kind of life. The new frontier would extend far into space, but also deep into the American psyche. The Kennedys brought an image of excellence and grace to American life. It would help create an illusion that later became known as Camelot. They appeared to live a charmed existence, never before seen in the White House. Theirs was a life and a family to emulate.
America is a young nation in 1960. You have all these veterans who came back from World War II, and they're having children, and they're buying houses in the suburbs. And America is, like Kennedy, sort of young and youthful and energetic, and Kennedy taps into that. The Kennedys are the idealized American family.
In Jackie, America had a first lady for the world to admire, a gracious hostess, an arbiter of style and fashion, an intelligent beauty, a natural diplomat.
She was something to watch. She was such a flirt. She would turn her eyes, her dark moonlit eyes, she would turn them toward the head of state, and she would lean over toward her and put her elbow on the table and her hand on her chin, right whispering into his ear. It was the most seductive thing I ever saw, and it worked. The men were crazy about her, and they would do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, I swear, for the United States of America.
No first lady had ever hired her own official fashion designer, but Jackie Kennedy did. He was Oleg Cassini, who would draw on his experience designing for Hollywood stars.
The job of a good designer in Hollywood is to make the star, which she was one of course, look at magnificent, at best, a possible way.
Jackie just revolutionized the nation's view of fashion. Every story I wrote back then about the event or whatever, I always had to have some paragraphs in there about the dress and where it came from.
But for the First Lady, high fashion came at a high price. It was Jack's multi-millionaire father, Joe Kennedy, who supported Jackie's glamorous lifestyle.
The father of the president paid the bills, reluctantly.
And there were more bills to be paid, more changes to be made. Even as she moved into the White House, Jackie began planning its renovation. The White House, she confided to friends, looked like it had been furnished by discount stores. Jackie set to work on an ambitious overhaul of the White House, made the cover of Life magazine, and starred in a televised tour of the newly restored presidential home, watched by tens of millions of viewers worldwide.
I just think that everything in the White House should be the best, the entertainment that's given here. And if it's an American company that you can help, I like to do that. If it's not, just as long as it's the best.
For White House state dinners and performances, she rustled up the best of what America had to offer.
This is the first in a series of concerts here at the White House.
As shrewd as he was in politics, John Kennedy was not as familiar with Jackie's world.
He was not an expert on music, classical music. In fact, he knew nothing about it. So the first few concerts, when the musician and the leader of the orchestra or the chamber music or whatever it was would come to the first movement and stop, there's a pause. The president always thought gratefully, oh, thank God it's over, and he would rush up and embrace the maestro or embrace the singer or the pianist. It was so funny, and he was so embarrassed when he realized that he was doing it all wrong. So he called me in and said, you're not supposed to allow that to happen. And I said, Mr. President, you go off, you dash off before anyone can stop you. You've leapt out of your chair. And he said, I want you to develop a signal system with me so that when it really is the end of the concert, I know. Well, I didn't know classical music all that well either, but I wasn't about to admit it. So I got one of the social aides who really knew his classical music. And we stood right in a crack in the great doors going into the East Room. And whenever the concert was really and truly over, I would stick a finger out and wag it at the president. And he kept looking every time, hoping that I was wagging my finger.
Into the Kennedy White House marched a parade of America's finest performers. There was music, ballet, and Shakespeare.
The look of the White House, the feel of it, it just took on this marvelous kind of aura.
That Kennedy aura that seduced and transfixed had a serious edge. The Kennedys were selling the presidency to American citizens, but they were also selling America on the world stage, showing the world divided by Cold War conflict that in the free world, beauty, culture, and arts were allowed to flourish. That was the message when Jackie traveled to India and Pakistan with her sister Lee Radziwill. Almost a year before, her husband had joked it was he who had accompanied Jackie to Paris. Now she was on a diplomatic mission of her own in a corner of the Third World ripe for Khrushchev's dream of Soviet communist expansion. The trip would serve as a proving ground for Jackie's developing diplomatic style, a mix of beauty, savvy, and grace. The trip was captured on film by the United States Information Agency, the propaganda arm of the U.S. government, and broadcast around the world. Throughout the Kennedy years, there were many public moments captured on film and in photographs, to be sure. But there were stolen, untouched moments as well, when no professional cameras were about. One place where that happened was Joe Kennedy's Palm Beach home. Red Fay, an old wartime buddy of Jack's, often joined the family there. Red liked to clown around a bit, and the Kennedys didn't seem to mind, joining in now and then, especially for Red's home movies.
I have some wonderful movies down in Florida of John and his father, Jack and young John in the swimming pool, and young John doing this and that against his father.
As tender as he was with his children, Jack avoided picking them up because of his bad back. Here, Red Fay takes over with John Jr. By way of painkillers or just plain stoicism, Jack didn't let his back keep him from playing along with family and friends. There was golf, tennis, touch football, or just a drive in an open car. This was a time and a place when a president could imagine that he was just a normal father.
We were down there in Florida for a dinner party, and they had a lot of distinguished guests there. And the two children, Caroline and John, came in and were introduced to everybody and went around the table. And I love young John at the end, as he left the room, he yelled, "Good night, poo-poo head," to his father. And his father, I love Jack saying, "Do you know that you're called the President of the United States a poo-poo head?"
These carefree private moments were few and far between. Back in Washington, life was neither carefree nor private. All presidents guard their secrets, this administration more than most. In 1962, Kennedy didn't even tell his closest advisors that he'd begun recording a limited number of White House phone calls and meetings. Their release now gives historians new materials with which to assess Kennedy's performance.
Kennedy starts taping in the late summer of 1962. On the surface, there are clearly indications that he saw this as a kind of electronic diary. His private secretary believed, I think rightly, that he intended to use this in writing his memoir. But then the question is, okay, why summer of '62 then? And the best guess that my colleagues and I have is that it's because in the summer of '62 he has the sense, I'm going into this period of major climactic crisis, and is a little more self-conscious about the burden of history.
It would be events recorded during 13 days in October 1962 that would most influence how we judge his presidency.
The missile crisis, which was not only the most dangerous moment in the Cold War, it can be argued that it was the most dangerous moment in all human history, because never before had two contending powers possessed between them the technical capacity to blow up the world.
Both sides possessed the power, and in October 1962, they would consider using it. April 1962, the Soviet Party chairman traveled from Moscow south to the Black Sea resort of Pitsunda for an important meeting of the country's Defense Council. Khrushchev's commanders told him that if nuclear war came, they would not be able to respond to an American first strike. Khrushchev had heard enough to convince him he had to find another way of threatening the American homeland. He decided then to send nuclear missiles to Cuba, to narrow Washington's lead in nuclear terror, and to defend a communist ally.
When I found out about the intention to send missiles to Cuba, I went to Khrushchev and told him I thought he was taking a very dangerous step. He asked me why I thought that, and I said, because I doubt that the US will tolerate such a step from our side, and we should expect a very strong reaction from their side. Khrushchev said that we weren't doing anything that the US hasn't done.
October 14th, 1962. Edwards Air Force Base, California. Major Richard Hauser is taking off in his U-2 spy plane, heading for Cuba. For weeks, Americans have been aware of an increased Soviet military presence on the island. Thousands of soldiers have been seen arriving on cargo ships. And despite Khrushchev's denials, the U-2 was intent on finding out what the Soviets were up to. Over a 6-minute span, 936 photos are taken. When they get to the lab, the pictures clearly show the presence of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Kennedy was shown the photographs in the White House on October 16th.
It would appear that with this type of missile, with the solid propellant and inertial guidance system, that it could well be operational within 2 weeks.
It is 4:30 on the afternoon of October 16th. Kennedy is being briefed by CIA analysts on the discovery of the Soviet missiles. His Secretary of Defense immediately considers whether the U.S. is justified in launching an invasion of Cuba.
To move beyond that into an invasion following the air attack means the application of tens of thousands, between 90 and over 150,000 men to the invasion forces. It seems to me almost certain that any one of these forms of direct military action will lead to a Soviet military response of some type, someplace in the world. It may well be worth the price. Perhaps we should pay that.
The voice of Secretary of Defense McNamara, recorded on the day he and the President were told that the Soviets had dramatically escalated the threat of war.
I was totally shocked. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand his motive, because he must have understood we would have to respond militarily. And that would be very, very dangerous for him and for us.
Kennedy was the first to see the big picture. This was more than a Soviet attempt to protect an ally. This was about strategic balance. This was about Berlin. He called Lucius Clay, the four-star general the President had assigned to protect American interests in the divided city.
So I suppose, General, we can anticipate difficulties in Berlin as well as other places, and I thought that we would keep you informed, and perhaps as the situation became more intense there, that you might be willing to come down later in the week.
I'm available at any time for anything, Mr. President.
Good. Fine. Well, if you get any thoughts on any of these matters, I hope you call General Taylor or me, because, as I said, it seems to me Berlin is a key problem, as it has been from the beginning in this whole matter. But I'll be in touch with you later in the week as we get situation involved in Berlin.
Yes, sir.
Good. Thanks, General. Right.
He is on a knife's edge between pools of fire, with a potential nuclear war over Cuba in October on the one hand, and what he perceives as a potential nuclear war over Berlin, with even greater stakes and an even worse position a month later.
For the next 2 days, Kennedy came under enormous pressure from the military to order an invasion of Cuba.
I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
Mr. President, in my judgment, from a military point of view, the lowest risk course of action, if we're thinking of protecting the people of the United States against a possible strike on us, is to go ahead with a surprise airstrike, the blockade, and an invasion. I do not see that as long as the Soviet Union is supporting Cuba, that there is any solution to the Cuban problem except a military solution. And so, as I say, from the military point of view, I feel that the lowest risk course of action is the full gamut of military action by us.
The problem is not really some war against Cuba, but the problem is part of this worldwide struggle against the communists, particularly, as I say, over Berlin.
As the generals increased their pressure to invade Cuba, thousands of U.S. troops were being deployed to Florida and Guantanamo Bay. Preparations that were being made without knowing that Soviet nuclear-tipped Luna missiles were in position on the Cuban beaches, ready to fire.
It wasn't until 29 years later that we learned that at that moment, the Soviets had 170 nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba, roughly 90 to be used against a U.S. invasion force, and about 70 to be targeted on East Coast metropolitan areas.
Вот представим себе, началась война.
There were 6 installations of Lunas in Cuba. If war had started in Cuba and I had only 1 rocket left, I wouldn't surrender. I would fire the rocket.
Kennedy didn't know any of this, but he didn't like the fact that the military was giving him few options. He turned to Bobby to intervene, asking his brother, in his absence, to chair meetings, to encourage debates, to find alternate solutions.
At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was President Kennedy would leave the room because he was aware that people might not be as frank in terms of discussing various alternatives, and he knew that my brother Bob would give him the essence of the comments. Bob was just an absolutely indispensable instrument in being able to get that kind of information, which he could make an informed and balanced judgment.
By October 20th, consensus had changed from an all-out invasion to a quarantine of Cuba. Kennedy summarized the day's events for his own private record.
During the course of the day, opinions had obviously switched from the advantages of a first strike on the missile site and on Cuban aviation to a blockade. For us to fail to respond would throw into question our willingness to respond over Berlin, would divide our allies and our country, that we would be faced with a crunch over Berlin in 2 or 3 months, and that by that time the Soviets would have a large missile arsenal in the Western Hemisphere, which would weaken our whole position in this hemisphere.
On October 22nd, Kennedy was ready to announce to the world the blockade of Cuba, the action that was one step short of an invasion. He brought in the congressional leadership for support, but he was instead accused of political weakness in the face of Soviet aggression. These recently declassified recordings illustrate the pressure Kennedy was under to attack Cuba.
If we invade Cuba, we have a chance that these missiles will be fired on us. In addition, Khrushchev will seize Berlin, and that Europe will regard Berlin's loss, which is of such symbolic importance to Berlin as having been the fall of the United States by acting in precipitous ways.
I don't see how we're going to get any stronger or get in any better position to meet this threat. It seems to me that we're at the crossroads. We're either a first-class power or we're not. I don't know whether Khrushchev will launch a nuclear war with Cuba or not. I don't believe he will. But I think that the more that we temporize, the more surely he is to convince himself that we are threatened to make any real movement and to really fight.
Let me just say, Senator, if we go into Cuba, we have to all realize that we are taking the chance that these missiles which are ready to fire won't be fired. So that is one hell of a gamble.
I don't like the idea of a blockade at all.
And what are you in favor of this?
I'm in favor on the basis of this information of an invasion and an all-out one as quickly as possible. But a blockade seems to me the worst of it all.
Kennedy was now in his 7th day of the crisis. His medical records show that the president had to dramatically increase his level of pain medication.
John Travell was giving what we probably call now trigger point injections, which were deep injections of Procaine, which is similar to lidocaine, which the dentist uses, into the muscles in his back and to trigger points around the back to relieve the pain both immediately and, in theory, to relax some of the muscles for later on relief. He'd need 6 injections in his back just to relieve the pain on a momentary basis.
We have tapes. We have a day-by-day assessment record of what he's saying, what he's thinking, what he's doing, and the conferences. I found him in these crises as lucid, as cogent as you'd ever want a president to be. Now, it may be that when he went to his private quarters at night, he was a bit zonked or laid low, so to speak, by taking so many medications. But when he was on duty, when he was dealing with these crises, I found him in tip-top shape, handling things as well as you would hope a president would handle them.
On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy went before the cameras to lay out the perilous road ahead.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy had set the terms of the crisis in a way that sought to step back from war. He now had to wait for Khrushchev's response. He was exhausted but in command. With the quarantine in place, there was still the possibility that the U.S. would be forced to launch an invasion. If the Soviet vessels continued through to Cuba, Kennedy was ready to order a full-scale attack. He understood that he had to control the levers of power, bring decision-making into the center, and coordinate all messages to avoid what he feared the most, war by miscalculation.
I recall leaving the White House on the night of Saturday, October 27, 1962, and thinking it was a perfectly gorgeous fall night, and I was leaving the president's office to go back to my office in the Pentagon, and I thought I might not live to see another Saturday night.
Kennedy was now alone in the Oval Office, contemplating how to salvage humanity from the carnage of nuclear war.
If we're going to have to do anything further than what we're now doing, we really ought to get some civil defense arrangements in those communities which are within the range of these things.
That's where the governors would be helpful.
Because if we ever were going to carry it out all the way, we ought to have those cities evacuated.
Kennedy maintained a tight control of the American government for 13 exhausting days. If America was to go to war, he would be the one giving the order.
As I understood, there's some report that the Russian ships were not going to stop. We were going to have to sink them. In order to stop them, I thought that we were going to have to fire on them. I was wondering whether the instructions on how that's to be done, or where they're to be shot at and so on, to cause the minimum of damage. And in addition, if they're boarded, it's very possible the Russians will fire at them as they board, and we'd have to fire back and have quite a slaughter.
It just, you sit back. I mean, he's an administration reputedly consisting of the best and the brightest. If you listen to the tapes in the missile crisis, it's just obvious that Kennedy is the best and the brightest in the room. That he's often 1 or 2 steps ahead of all of his advisors in thinking through the implications. He's asking the best questions. He's very poorly served, in my judgment, by his staff. But because his capabilities can be so impressive, can regularly rescue the system from disaster.
Kennedy wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. In Moscow, Khrushchev had been at his desk for 3 days. He feared the door leading to a peaceful settlement was about to shut.
Civilians were not really aware of the danger of the situation. Those who knew what was going on tried not to talk about it. Of course, Khrushchev was getting very nervous, especially that Saturday and Sunday.
Kennedy offered Khrushchev a secret deal. In return for complete withdrawal of Soviet missiles, Kennedy would issue a non-aggression pledge and privately withdraw American short-range missiles from Turkey. But even as he considered the offer, Khrushchev received word that the Americans appeared poised to invade Cuba.
At a meeting on Sunday, a representative of ours came in and said, "I've been told that at 3 o'clock Moscow time, Kennedy will make another speech." Everyone thought that this speech was going to be the one where he announces an American invasion of Cuba, or that a bomb had been dropped. The decision was made to send a letter to Kennedy that said that the USSR accepts his terms and is ready to take the rockets out of Cuba. Khrushchev even gave orders to broadcast this on the radio.
The transmission of the acceptance of the offer was considered necessary because Khrushchev feared that if he used the normal diplomatic channels, his country would be at war by the time it arrived in Washington.
We avoided nuclear war by a hair's breadth. And at the end, it wasn't the wisdom of Kennedy and, let's say, his associates that avoided war. It was luck. It was luck.
Luck, maybe, but war was avoided in part because this president had learned from the Bay of Pigs that recommendations coming from the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to be questioned, that the greatest exercise of presidential leadership was often knowing when not to employ the military option.
You do read in the documents, though, that a lot of his contemporaries were plainly profoundly impressed with his performance in the crisis. But you don't know whether to credit that to myth-making or to something real. And then you listen to the tapes of the crisis, and then you understand.
Reading back historically, it really didn't surprise me all that. I was relieved and personally grateful for the decisions making, but it really didn't surprised me that that was a reflective of the true mettle of the man. That was sort of the person that I think those of us who knew him and loved him and understood him was the sort of the essence of the character that we'd seen in other instances as well.
Kennedy was to occupy the White House for just 1,000 days. None would be harder or more instrumental in historians' judgment of his performance than those 13 days in October 1962. He wanted Washington to respond by crossing the border and tearing the fence down. Egon Bahr was Brandt's principal deputy.
I went immediately to the City Hall. Brandt was called a little bit earlier, and he was immediately at the borderline. And then he went to the three commandants and came back furious, because they are incapable. I cannot tell you in English the real word he said, Arschlöcher. They had no orders. They did nothing.
For 3 days, Kennedy refused to comment. During this time, he was on vacation at the family compound at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, sailing apparently without a care in the world. In reality, Kennedy was relieved to see the wall go up. He knew it provided Khrushchev a way out of direct confrontation with the West.
Kennedy's problem was we couldn't defend Berlin or West Germany or Western Europe without using nuclear weapons. We had 15,000 troops with the British and French in Berlin. They were surrounded by 30 divisions of the Red Army. The Soviets could have taken Berlin.
Kennedy matched the escalation. He sent Congress a request for an additional $3.5 billion in defense spending, a tripling of the draft, and authority to call up the reserves. One policy was non-negotiable. The U.S. intended to honor its commitment to defend West Berlin.
We do not want to fight, but we have fought before, and others in earlier times have made the same dangerous mistake of assuming that the West was too selfish and too soft and too divided to resist invasions of freedom in other lands. To sum it all up, we seek peace, but we shall not surrender.
But there was one glaring qualification. The American pledge was limited to West Berlin. Kennedy made no mention of American rights to unfettered access to the whole of the German capital. That omission gave Khrushchev his opening.
Kennedy is saying he wants to preserve his influence in West Berlin and maintain the status quo there. He spells out his conditions, and he signals to the Soviets, if you follow these conditions, you can do whatever you like in and with East Berlin.
All of Khrushchev's grand schemes required resolution of the Berlin crisis. 1,500 East Berliners a day were flooding across the open border with the West. 3,500 doctors had crossed in the previous 2 years. Teachers, scientists, lawyers, East Germany was losing its entire professional class. Berlin had become the focal point of the Cold War, and Kennedy knew it.
He didn't think about anything else. He wasn't thinking about his legislative program for the year or any of the other things that occupy presidents. This is the problem that was going to occupy him, and until it was settled, that nothing else was going to get done much.
Shortly after Jack's death, Bobby recorded an oral history for the Kennedy Library that's been released for this program. Bobby knew that at this stage in his presidency, his brother was preoccupied with the thought of fighting a nuclear war over Berlin.
He had a hell of a tough time, you see, after the Bay of Pigs. Not just rising out of the Bay of Pigs, but Berlin.
Yeah.
Which people really, I don't think, understood generally around the country. No. The president felt strongly, and I did, that we were very close to war.
1 week after the Vienna summit, Khrushchev announced a 1/3 increase in Soviet defense spending. On August 13, 1961, Khrushchev gave his response. Thousands of East German troops moved into position at every crossing point between East and West. The construction of the Berlin Wall was about to begin. In the western sector, there was a fear of a communist invasion. 10,500 East German troops marched up to the partition line and stopped.
And when the news was broadcast over the radio and printed in the newspapers, one simply couldn't believe it. One simply couldn't imagine it. We were speechless to imagine that this whole city was separated just like that. There were relatives on both sides. People who looked after their old parents in the East, for example. And some of them died without having ever seen each other again.
Standing along the line dividing Berlin, Mayor Willy Brandt felt that the Soviets had provoked the worst crisis of the Cold War.
In a day. They could have taken West Germany in a couple of weeks. Maybe they would have gotten all the way to the Atlantic. That was, and Kennedy had only one option if that began. That was either to let them do it or to use nuclear weapons.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara immediately recognized that Khrushchev had diffused a volatile situation and handed the West a colossal propaganda coup.
It was a symbol of their weakness. Hell, they built the wall to hold back the East Germans who wanted to leave East Germany and go to the West. So, and that's the way Kennedy interpreted it. We should make the West see this as a major sign of weakness of the Soviets, which it was. And therefore, he resisted the pressure from those who said, apply military force to tear down the wall. There were many who did say that.
By the fourth day, when there was still no move by the Western powers, Phase 2 was ordered by Moscow. The barbed wire was replaced by a pair of concrete walls, 12 feet high, separated by a death zone, a 50-foot strip filled with landmines. And yet still they came, thousands willing to risk everything for one desperate dash across